The Pacific sky in 1943 held a kind of silence that only men who had survived its violence ever truly understood. It was not the peaceful quiet of an untouched horizon, but the deceptive pause between storms, the breath before machines of war tore the air apart. Long after the conflict ended, veterans would say that the sky had a personality of its own, brooding, watchful, often cruel. On one such day, a Japanese Zero pilot named Saburo Hayashi drifted through that silence, unaware that he was gliding toward 8 American dive bombers whose presence would nearly end his life. But the story did not begin there, because nothing in the Pacific War existed by accident. The chain of events that brought him to that moment had been forged in the invisible machinery of wartime intelligence, secret decisions made in rooms lit by dim lamps, and encoded messages that traveled through the ether long before a single aircraft took to the sky. The Zero he flew was more than a fighter plane. It was a symbol of Japan's early dominance, a weapon crafted from a philosophy of speed, fragility, and absolute trust in the pilot's skill. Its lightweight frame gave it unmatched agility, but that same gift meant it offered almost no protection. Western analysts had long misunderstood this design, believing the Japanese simply lacked the material resources to build anything more durable, when in truth, the engineers of the Nakajima and Mitsubishi factories had consciously chosen sacrifice. A Zero was meant to be elusive, untouchable, almost spiritual in its purity of movement. To be hit was to fail, and the pilot accepted this. Hayashi, barely 21, had internalized that doctrine deeply enough that he never questioned the thin layer of aluminum separating him from the void. The American dive bombers he would soon encounter had launched from a carrier whose position Japan believed it knew. Ultra and Magic, the code-breaking networks run by the Allies, had long since penetrated several layers of Japanese naval communication, though only a handful of officers on the American side understood the full extent of this. Secrets floated within secrets, decrypted messages carefully disguised as reconnaissance sightings, operational decisions masked as last-minute improvisations. Entire battles were fought in the shadows before they were fought in the open, and the pilots who took to the air rarely knew that they were actors on a stage already rigged by intelligence analysts thousands of miles away. The American bomber's flight path had been calculated not merely by tactical needs, but by the unseen hands of codebreakers operating out of dim rooms in Pearl Harbor and Melbourne, who had intercepted a Japanese transmission indicating a slight shift in patrol patterns. That single radio message, decrypted by a machine whose operators were sworn to secrecy, had determined where these aircraft would be at the exact moment Hayashi's Zero crossed their path. Hayashi himself had launched not because of a direct threat, but because of a whisper in the Japanese command structure. Earlier that morning, a reconnaissance pilot had reported seeing silhouettes he could not identify. Intelligence officers, already shaken by subtle signs that American operations were becoming unnervingly precise, feared infiltration, leaks, or even espionage within their own ranks. Unknown to most pilots, the Japanese Navy was slowly drowning in its own inability to recognize that the Americans had cracked key operational codes months before Midway. Rumors spread softly through the officer corps, quiet suspicions of traitors, saboteurs, or careless operators compromising the Empire's war effort. To counter this paranoia, reconnaissance flights were increased, patrol routes expanded, and young pilots like Hayashi were sent into the sky as both hunters and watchmen, never told the full reason. He flew with no enemy in sight, only the endless blue stretching out beneath him and clouds forming distant walls of pale white ahead. The Pacific sun shimmered against the sea surface, masquerading as islands where none existed, 1,000 illusions dancing in the heat. Pilots knew these mirages well, yet they could never fully ignore them. Sometimes a reflection meant a carrier's hull, or the final glint of a doomed aircraft sinking beneath the waves. Hayashi checked his instruments, a gesture more habitual than necessary. The Zero's cockpit was so minimalistic that a pilot came to trust instinct more than needles and gauges. Miles away, the 8 American Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers flew in loose formation, their engines forming a rhythmic growl that vibrated through the thin metal frames. The Dauntless crews were veterans of Coral Sea and Guadalcanal, battles where survival had often depended on nothing more than seconds or sheer luck. They carried scars that did not show on their young faces, memories of burning carriers, abandoned ships, and comrades lost to both the ocean and the firestorms that erupted during deck landings gone wrong. Yet something else haunted them, something they rarely discussed openly, the creeping sense that the enemy always seemed to know more than expected, that Japanese fighters appeared at uncanny times as if guided by invisible instructions. They never suspected that Japan, too, was being watched, every signal, every operation, every shift in command intercepted by American codebreakers whose existence was erased from official records for decades. It was into this invisible conflict that Hayashi unwittingly flew. His orders were vague: investigate unusual shadows south of the patrol zone and maintain radio silence. Radio silence was normal. What was not normal was the tone of the officer who delivered the instruction, a tone brittle enough to hint at fear. Young pilots rarely sensed the political winds blowing above them, but Hayashi could feel something shifting, something unseen. Perhaps it was the war itself bending toward a new phase, one where Japan's early momentum was slowing under the weight of industrial shortages, overstretched supply lines, and the relentless pressure of American factories producing planes and ships at rates Japan could never match. But Hayashi did not know this. He sensed only the rising tension in briefings, the clipped sentences, the sudden obsession with small procedural details. He spotted the American planes not as shapes, but as flashes, light catching on metal in rhythmic pulses. He narrowed his eyes, lowering altitude, instinct telling him they had not seen him yet. 8 dive bombers, unescorted, spread in a loose crescent across the sky. His training surged into him, an instinctive tightening of muscles, a mental shift into combat readiness. Yet in the same instant, another sensation held him back, the faintest intrusion of doubt, or maybe curiosity. There were too many unknowns. Why were they flying so low? Why without escort? Why toward a region Japan believed secured? At that moment, his mind became something rare in the Pacific Air War, reflective rather than reactive. He eased the Zero alongside them instead of attacking immediately, a gesture that could be interpreted as arrogance, playfulness, or hesitation, depending on who recalled the moment. The American crews saw him seconds later, and tension snapped through all 8 planes. Gunners swiveled their weapons, pilots steadied their controls, and radio men shouted warnings that dissolved into static. Yet the Zero did not fire. It glided, ghost-like, just beyond the optimal firing arc, almost as if observing rather than engaging. Such behavior was uncommon among Japanese fighter pilots, who were taught to strike swiftly and without signaling intent. But Hayashi was not acting out of mercy. He was acting out of the odd intuition that something about this encounter did not fit the rhythm of normal combat. Perhaps he suspected a trap, or perhaps he felt the subtle weight of the mysterious orders that had sent him on this patrol. He eased the Zero alongside them instead of attacking immediately, a gesture that could be interpreted as arrogance, playfulness, or hesitation, depending on who recalled the moment. The American crews saw him seconds later, and tension snapped through all 8 planes. Gunners swiveled their weapons, pilots steadied their controls, and radio men shouted warnings that dissolved into static. Yet the Zero did not fire. It glided, ghost-like, just beyond the optimal firing arc, almost as if observing rather than engaging. Such behavior was uncommon among Japanese fighter pilots, who were taught to strike swiftly and without signaling intent. But Hayashi was not acting out of mercy. He was acting out of the odd intuition that something about this encounter did not fit the rhythm of normal combat. Perhaps he suspected a trap, or perhaps he felt the subtle weight of the mysterious orders that had sent him on this patrol. He eased the Zero alongside them instead of attacking immediately, a gesture that could be interpreted as arrogance, playfulness, or hesitation, depending on who recalled the moment.
The American crews saw him seconds later, and tension snapped through all 8 planes. Gunners swiveled their weapons, pilots steadied their controls, and radio men shouted warnings that dissolved into static. Yet the Zero did not fire. It glided, ghost-like, just beyond the optimal firing arc, almost as if observing rather than engaging. Such behavior was uncommon among Japanese fighter pilots, who were taught to strike swiftly and without signaling intent. But Hayashi was not acting out of mercy. He was acting out of the odd intuition that something about this encounter did not fit the rhythm of normal combat. Perhaps he suspected a trap, or perhaps he felt the subtle weight of the mysterious orders that had sent him on this patrol. He eased the Zero alongside them instead of attacking immediately, a gesture that could be interpreted as arrogance, playfulness, or hesitation, depending on who recalled the moment. The American crews saw him seconds later, and tension snapped through all 8 planes. Gunners swiveled their weapons, pilots steadied their controls, and radio men shouted warnings that dissolved into static. Yet the Zero did not fire. It glided, ghost-like, just beyond the optimal firing.
He pulled back, trying to stabilize, but the damage was too severe. The Zero began a slow, spiraling descent. The American crews watched, breaths thin, weapons silent now. There was no triumph in their eyes, only the hollow residue of survival. They had seen too many men die in flames to celebrate another falling from the sky. The spiraling Zero seemed less like an enemy vanquished and more like a reminder of the war's moral ambiguity. A sky where young men were thrown into conflict, shaped by strategies and secrets they would never learn. As Hayashi fought the failing controls, fragments of training and memory blurred together. He thought of his instructor's warnings: a Zero is a blade. If it bends, it breaks. He thought of his childhood near the fishing ports of Shikoku, watching the waves collapse against the shore. He thought of the rising fear permeating every Japanese command briefing in recent months, the subtle awareness that America was adjusting too quickly, anticipating too much, responding with unnerving accuracy. Pilots were told to trust the Empire's strength, but even they could feel the tremors beneath the surface. And now, spinning toward the sea, he confronted the reality that had haunted Japanese high command. They were fighting an enemy who knew their movements before they happened. He managed to level out the Zero enough to skim the waves. The engine coughed, sputtered, died. For a moment, the plane glided in ghostly silence, its shadow skimming the Pacific water. Then it hit. The impact tore the wings apart, the fuselage crumpling as it skipped once, twice, then disappeared into the spray. The American bombers continued their mission, heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. None of them knew that their flight path had been determined by Japanese communications. None knew that the lone Zero pilot had been sent out in fear that coded messages had been compromised. None knew they had just participated in a small fragment of a vast intelligence war that shaped every moment of the Pacific conflict. Hayashi survived the crash. Bruised, bleeding, barely conscious, he clawed his way from the sinking wreckage, finding a piece of floating debris to cling to. The Pacific offered no mercy. Days blurred. Sun scorched him. Night froze him. He drifted between delirium and memory, haunted by visions of the dive bombers and the shadows that had led him to them. He did not know that Japanese search planes were looking in the wrong places due to misinterpreted signals. He did not know American codebreakers had predicted Japanese search patterns would avoid that sector. He simply drifted, fighting waves that felt as relentless as fate itself. When he was finally found by a Japanese patrol boat, he was barely alive. His survival was hailed as a testament to the warrior spirit, a story repeated in mess halls and training rooms. But within higher levels of command, his encounter fueled darker suspicions. Officers whispered that their codes were compromised, transmissions monitored, strategies anticipated. Some blamed sabotage, some blamed spies, others blamed the Americans' uncanny luck. Yet none understood the full truth. that the intelligence war had already surpassed their ability to conceal. Hayashi returned to service months later, changed in ways he could not express. The encounter with the 8 dive bombers became a ghost in his memory, a moment suspended between life and death. The strange, silent parallel flight lingered, raising questions he never voiced. Why had he hesitated? Why did fate place him there alone? Why did the Americans seem to fly as if guided by invisible signals? He flew more missions, but a quiet awareness formed in him. The war was shifting beyond the reach of pilots. It was being fought in the shadows, in radio waves, in encrypted messages and decoded patterns, and pilots were pieces moved across a board they could not see. By the end of the war, Hayashi, like many survivors, discovered the truth. Japan's naval codes had been broken long before he ever entered combat. Movements, deployments, patrols, all had been monitored. His near-fatal encounter with the 8 dive bombers had not been a random meeting in an open sky. It had been the result of a chain of invisible decisions shaped by intelligence officers on both sides, a chance that was never truly chance. Looking back, he realized that the moment he pulled alongside those bombers, he had stepped unknowingly into the center of a hidden war, a war of shadows, signals, and secrets. The kind of war pilots could feel but never understand. The kind of war that shaped destinies long before engines started and propellers turned. And in the vast, indifferent sky of the Pacific, that truth lingered like the fading echo of engines long gone. A reminder that behind every visible battle was another, deeper one that decided who lived, who died, and who drifted between worlds, surviving by inches on the surface of a merciless sea.